what are the other explanations for this? If China certainly knew that this was highly transmissible, and they then said it wasn't, well, why would they say that it wasn't? Now, as I said, I'm not in Xi Jinping's mind. I don't know what his intent was for sure. But you have to look at what they did. And what they did would inevitably lead to the spread of this virus outside of China's borders. It would inevitably lead to public health officials in other countries not taking the precautions that were absolutely necessary at that point. So the culpability here is real. You could say it's reckless, you could say it's intentional, but the one thing that you have to say is that the actions that the Chinese government took led to the spread of this virus around the world. They could have warned the world. They didn't do it. Matter of fact, they tried to put the world off. So, don't take it from me. Just look at the facts.
Just how did the actions of the Chinese Communist Party directly lead to this global COVID-19 pandemic? Has the US reached a Pearl Harbor or Sputnik moment with respect to the Chinese regime? Could it be possible that the severity of the COVID-19 reality in China was intentionally downplayed to allow for the global spread of the virus? And, with the world focused on the pandemic, how is the People's Liberation Army becoming increasingly belligerent? In this episode, we sit down with Chang, a political commentator, China analyst, and author of The Coming Collapse of China. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Chang, so wonderful to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you so much, Jan.
Gordon, I was looking through my Twitter feed this morning, as I often tend to, and I know you do as well, and I caught quite an amazing tweet. It came from no less than Hu Xijin, who's the editor-in-chief of the Global Times, one of the mouthpieces of the Chinese Communist Party, so, an agent of the party. He says, some people have said America is encountering a Pearl Harbor moment, a wake-up call. But please remember the enemy of the U.S. is coronavirus, not China. China is a partner. Medical equipment is on the way. Stay strong, America. Anyway, so much in that tweet, and I can see the wheels turning in your head, or I can imagine them anyway. But for starters, let's just talk about this. This is the first time I've heard it called this. Is this a Pearl Harbor moment?
I don't think so, Jan. Pearl Harbor was when the United States was attacked. It was the start of a war. China actually has been attacking our society for decades. And it was last May that People's Daily ran a piece from Global Times, which said that China had declared a quote unquote people's war on us. So being carried by People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, that's official. It was also carried, I think, by Xinhua News Agency, the official Chinese government media outlet. So there's been a war for some time. So this is not the Pearl Harbor moment. I do hope, though, that Americans wake up and understand the fundamental nature of the Chinese challenge. So you might want to say Sputnik moment, but clearly, whatever you want to say, this is a time when I think Americans are starting to realize the maliciousness of China's challenge to the U.S. and the fundamental nature of its attack.
Well, he's saying here, stay strong, America. That seems pretty friendly.
Yeah, of course. Got to remember, though, what's the context of this? China has, for instance, March 12th, you had a foreign ministry spokesman said that the coronavirus patient zero was in the U.S. and that it was the U.S. Army that spread the virus to Wuhan. That is many things, but one of them is that Chinese leaders in their own minds were justifying retaliation on the U.S. With intimating germ warfare, that's an act of war, of course. So you got to look at the context. Also, got to remember that China knew about the human-to-human nature of coronavirus. They knew about it from about, let's say, the second week of December, when Wuhan doctors were noticing that this virus was spreading. And the only way that you can account for that was that it was going from human to human. But Beijing did not acknowledge that until January 20, when it had a famed virologist appear on China Central Television. And it was the following day when there was the official acknowledgement of human to human transfer. The reason why this is critical and why it's relevant to the Global Times piece is essentially that China knew that this virus would spread, but it tried to lull, I think, governments into not taking action. Got to remember that infamous January 14th tweet from the World Health Organization, which, based on China's discussions with the WHO, WHO was saying that they didn't see human to human transmission. Um, I don't know what was in Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler's mind, but he probably saw how crippled China was, and if he was thinking that he probably, and if he wanted to cripple other societies, he would have done exactly what, in fact, he did. So when they say "Stay strong, America," you have to view it in the context of taking actions which have ended up in the crippling of America.
Gordon, that's quite an astounding statement. I mean, you're basically suggesting that Xi Jinping may have deliberately said this, or the Chinese leadership may have deliberately said it this way, and said that coronavirus isn't human to human transmissible, so that it would spread around the world and cripple the rest of the world.
Okay, Jan, what are the other explanations for this? If China certainly knew that this was highly transmissible, and they then said it wasn't, well, why would they say that it wasn't? Now, as I said, I'm not in Xi Jinping's mind. I don't know what his intent was for sure. But you have to look at what they did. And what they did would inevitably lead to the spread of this virus outside of China's borders. It would inevitably lead to public health officials in other countries not taking the precautions that were absolutely necessary at that point. So the culpability here is real. You could say it's reckless, you could say it's intentional. But the one thing that you have to say is that the actions that the Chinese government took led to the spread of this virus around the world. They could have warned the world. They didn't do it. Matter of fact, they tried to put the world off. So, don't take it from me. Just look at the facts.
Gordon, you're really capturing my imagination here, because, in the Communist Party system, as you well know, the party and the survival of the party is the top priority at all times, and actually human life, as we know, looking at, I don't know, forced organ harvesting, something that we've been talking, it just isn't valued very highly. So, given all this, this is actually a realistic scenario in my mind.
Well, it's certainly suggested by the facts. As I said, you shouldn't take it from me, but just look at what in fact occurred. And it's a horrible conclusion. It's a conclusion that we Americans don't want to think about. Nobody wants to think about this. But nonetheless, there's only one way you can come out on this.
So, Gordon, we were just speaking about the WHO being, compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. There was this recent viral video. I mean, I don't know, I think it's gotten 8 million views or something like this, of the Hong Kong journalist, asking a WHO official about Taiwan, and, getting very strange responses, to put it nicely. Now we're seeing the Hong Kong government basically censoring that media, saying and that they did something wrong. What's going on here?
The Hong Kong government is saying that interview by RTHK violates the One China principle. And that interview was last Saturday. It was Bruce Alward, who is the #2 guy at the WHO, couldn't deal with the issue of Taiwan at all. Obviously, this is a sensitive one for Beijing, but it shouldn't be a sensitive one for the World Health Organization, because, John, if you look at all the 195 or so countries in the world, the one country that's had the most effective, the best response to the coronavirus, it's been Taiwan. So Taiwan, the WHO can learn a lot from Taiwan right now, and of course, so could China. But at this particular time, we have the WHO really acting like a part of the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese central government, and it's completely ignoring the help it could get from Taiwan. We're in a crisis now, and it's in a broad sense a crisis for humanity, and humanity needs all the help that it can, especially from the 4 million people on Taiwan.
Yeah, it's not the time to play politics, right? Yeah,
Absolutely not the time to
yeah.
play politics. We've lost a lot of people. We're going to lose a lot more people. This is a time where it's going to be very serious for us. This is a bug which is really transmissible, partially lethal, can do a lot of damage to the human race.
You mentioned the foreign ministry spokesperson coming out and talking about this originating in America, perhaps with the American military. Um, at the same time, or a few days later, we have the Chinese ambassador to America, so-called distancing himself from this. And there were a number of media articles talking about how, oh, actually, China doesn't really believe that. What do you make of these kind of different narratives coming from CCP spokespeople?
There's a number of different interpretations for that. And matter of fact, there is that Reuters article that talked about the split in the foreign ministry between the older, more senior folks who have a more benign view, or supposedly more benign, and the younger ones who are nationalists, like, for instance, Zhao Lijiang, the author of that March 12th tweet. But whatever it is, and this is a very long conversation. The one thing that we have not heard the Chinese Foreign Ministry issue an apology to the United States for that inflammatory, dangerous, false tweet. And that was not the only tweet on that day. There were 3 tweets from the foreign ministry's spokespeople. So until we have that apology, I think that we have to take a dark view of what's going on. As I said, I don't know. There are a number of different views on this, but until we get that apology, we certainly know that there has not been a fundamental change in viewpoint inside the foreign ministry or indeed the Communist Party itself.
We're seeing right now in China, basically things coming back to business as usual, ostensibly. At least that's what we don't really know because there aren't really journalists in China anymore. But that's at least what China's saying. There's concerns at the same time that this may not be the situation, that the pandemic might still be raging there. What does your intel tell you?
Well, I think that we are seeing the second wave of coronavirus infections in China. Um, I don't know, but the Chinese authorities are taking actions that are consistent only with a new wave of the epidemic. So, for instance, last Friday, they closed all the theaters in China just a week after opening them up. Tourist attractions in Shanghai have been closed down, about 30 of them. The same thing in Chengdu, same thing in Anhui province. Matter of fact, a county in Hunan province was just locked down. So, we haven't seen, for instance, the rescheduling of the National People's Congress meeting. The college entrance examination has been postponed by a month. That occurred, I guess, a week or so ago. These are actions that indicate that Chinese leaders are concerned about transmissions. And that would make sense, John, because got to remember that Xi Jinping, in the first week of February, when the virus was raging around China, decided that it was time for China to get back to work. So he forced workers back to their job sites. He's forced the opening of all of these venues. And so, what we know about this bug, that would lead to a new round of infection. So, I think that that's what's occurring at this particular time.
Um, this just makes me think of this, that a lot of media in the West are taking the information coming out of China somewhat uncritically, right? China says or the Chinese Communist Party says, we've conquered it. Look how great we've done. There's reporting, pretty much to exactly that effect. There's actually, even Johns Hopkins and many major media take the Chinese numbers, which have recently been heavily disputed. We've had a number of articles on this, just as if they're factual. I just saw another piece that explained that the Chinese numbers, the way they've been counted, even that has changed 8 times since the beginning. So, there's two questions here. One is, why are we as a society, taking a lot of these numbers so uncritically? Of course, at the Epoch Times, we don't do that, but in general, why is that still, despite everything that we've seen? And secondly, do you buy the numbers?
Yeah, I don't buy the Chinese numbers because we've seen behaviors that are inconsistent with the reporting of a low number of infections and low numbers of deaths. Um, that's there's been a number of stories about showing how this could not be. The first question is the fascinating one, because it goes into the mentality of others around the world. And I think that there's a number of explanations, some of them benign, some of them not so benign. But I think mostly it's really a question of news media, just the news organizations, they're reporting what they're reporting, and sometimes they get sloppy. So for instance, there wouldn't be a problem if they said this is what China has reported, and there are great questions about underreporting of infections and deaths. But they don't have the time to do that. So what they do is they produce these charts or they say these things without the necessary qualifications. So China engages in propaganda. Well, why do they do it? Well, because it works.
And it's quite amazing. Speaking of which, speaking of propaganda, one of the big pieces of propaganda right now is what was in that initial tweet that I read out, which is basically that China is coming to the salvation of the world with all of its, masks and other things. I mean, this is a massive propaganda push by any measure. Can you kind of dig into that for us a little bit?
Well, this is Beijing trying to get push forward the notion that it should be the one at the center of the international system, that the U.S. is incompetent, it's in terminal decline, it's not a good steward of the global financial system. I mean, you name it. We've heard these for years and years and years. So what's really striking about this is that China is clearly culpable. China clearly was the source of this. But Xi Jinping is very bold. He's like Mao Zedong in a sense, seizing any opportunity, even one where you would think that China would be a little bit bashful for what it's done. It is really just trying to rewrite not just history, but as people say, it's trying to rewrite the present. Um, this is combined with Xi Jinping's notion and the notion of previous Chinese general secretaries that there's only one sovereign state in the world, there's only one legitimate ruler, and that's China's. This whole notion that the Chinese ruler is responsible for everything under the heavens, under Tianxia. So when you combine China's propaganda push in terms of the coronavirus and their just general notions that they have the right to rule the world, it gets really scary. And Chinese leaders haven't been bashful about talking about Tianxia. And they have been using these themes. Xi Jinping has been using these themes, for instance, in the 2008 Olympics, for which he was responsible. You look at the motto for the Summer Games that year. You look at some of the things that he's been saying recently, and some of the things he's had his foreign minister, Wang Yi, say, very clearly pointing to the notion that that everybody else is a subject of China, and that we're all vassals of the greater celestial court in Beijing.
This just makes me think of a conversation I just had not a couple of hours ago with a senior member of the administration. We were talking about, how the U.S. views development and how China views development. Essentially, the juxtaposition that emerged, and now I'm thinking of, is that, the U.S., when it's, sending aid or sending resources or whatever to other countries, the idea behind it is to help them become self-sufficient so that they can deal with, life and of course pandemics and anything else that happens, whereas the China model is basically to create dependency, whether it's through these loans that can't be paid back and so forth. I don't know. This a new thought and a stark juxtaposition. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for instance, the Marshall Plan, starting after the end of the World War II, and our programs, capacity building programs around the world, clearly we are trying to help societies help themselves. China's Belt and Road and its other initiatives really are meant to force nations into a dependent state. And we see this across the board. So I think that that's a very good generalization for the way to view the way Beijing looks at the world. Beijing views it very hierarchical, with the Chinese at the top and everybody else at the bottom. So you don't see what the U.S. has been trying to do. You don't see the Chinese doing this. And we've got to be concerned because a China-centric world would be so much worse. And I think people around the world understand that. It's just that China right now looks invincible, especially coming out of the coronavirus, allegedly. But as I said, I think that the second wave of this bug is the bug gets the last word. And the second wave of this bug is, I think, going to, end for a very long time. This notion that China is going to dominate the 21st century.
Um, you've been a big advocate of bringing manufacturing and supply chains back to America. Um, Presumably because of this threat. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about this whole approach? And recently, I just interviewed Rosemary Gibson about the idea that 90% of the precursors to medicines globally are basically sourced in China. I mean, this is powerful leverage to hold over other countries.
It's powerful leverage. China has threatened to use that leverage in connection with the coronavirus epidemic. Remember, Xinhua News Agency, first week of March, talked about plunging, quote unquote, plunging the United States into the, quote, mighty sea of coronavirus. But this was more than just an idle threat. As Peter Navarro, President Trump's trade advisor, has said that China nationalized the production of a U.S. factory in China, the one that was making N95 masks. Also, Maria Bartiromo of Fox News and Fox Business mentioned on air a number of times that China actually turned around a ship which was carrying medical protective gear, gowns, masks, whatever, gloves, that were headed to New York hospitals. It turned it around because China decided it wanted it itself. So there's no question that China is willing to go to great lengths to use its position in the global supply chains to get what it wants. So that means that we're just not left with very much choice. As Rosemary Gibson, who is really the Paul Revere in many ways, has been saying with her book and with her many public appearances, this is just crazy. But this is not just, of course, pharmaceuticals. You go across the board, China makes a lot of stuff that the United States absolutely needs. And we need to get our supply chains out of China, first of all, either into friendly countries, and in some cases, including pharmaceuticals, we need to get that stuff inside our borders because we can't rely on anybody else. As Navarro said, during the H1N1 epidemic of 2009, Australia blocked the sale of 35 million doses of vaccine. So we don't have a choice.
You're reminding me of these recent reports from Australia and actually a few other countries now that Chinese proxy companies were actually going into these countries and buying up all sorts of protective gear, masks and ventilators and so on and so forth. I mean, I found that astounding.
Well, it's astounding, but you got to remember, okay, buying stuff up, that's fine. But you got to remember that at the same time, the Chinese government was telling the world not to worry in a number of different ways by undercounting the number of infections, by making this look less severe than it actually was. And as we just talked about, by denying the existence of human to human transmission, which was a deeply malicious act. So while Beijing was doing this, you have China's agents running around the world buying up all the protective gear and the ventilators and the equipment. I mean, What can you say?
Gordon, something that you've also been pointing out recently, because I follow your Twitter feed quite closely, is yet another example of how Chinese companies themselves are fabricating their reality, their numbers. I think there was a particular a scenario dealing with coffee. I think that you mentioned. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, this you're talking about something that was disclosed today. The stock of Luckin Coffee, the Chinese version of Starbucks, fell 80% because the chief operating officer was making up sales. Um, you know, this occurs around the world. It's not just China, of course. I mean, we've got our Enron, but the difference is that this is something which is prevalent throughout China. There are really no or very few in terms of repercussions in China because of the nature of the system. At least in the U.S., you've got courts, you've got SEC, you've got all sorts of bodies that prevent this from occurring on a regular basis. So, we just, and the bigger lesson here is like, how much longer are we going to allow American pension funds, for instance, to invest in China, including federal pension funds? So I think that this should be a Pearl Harbor moment, Sputnik moment, whatever you want to call it, Jan. But this should be a moment where we say enough is enough, and we are no longer going to allow Americans to invest in China's markets. There's a lot of reasons to do that, but one of them is the Luckin Coffee reason, and that is that the numbers are bad, and you can't make sound financial decisions on unreliable statistics and numbers and financial reports.
I'm hearing a lot of rumblings from all sorts of people about, these ideas that you're describing right now. At the same time, Peter Navarro, we were talking about him earlier, he's in the process of drafting this Buy American executive order. And I've been kind of tracking a bit of the pushback there where some of the what we call the big pharma lobby is saying, no, this isn't really a good idea. So, given you believe this is a no-brainer. Rosemary Gibson believes this is a no-brainer. I think a lot of Americans, from what I'm hearing, think it's a no-brainer. Why would they be pushing back against this?
Well, because they're making money by keeping their production in China. It costs money to move it. They've got cozy relationships. They've got big profit margins. So, what's not to like? What's not to like if you're a company? But if you're an American citizen, there's a lot not to like. And this executive order is, I think I don't know, but I think it looks like it's the subject of intense infighting at the top of the Trump administration. For the reason you mentioned, you got the pharma lobby, you got other lobbies. Plus, also you've just got a general view in some members of President Trump's team that we got to have enduring relationships with China. So I hope Navarro wins this one. I thought this executive order would have been issued a long time ago, and I'm a little bit concerned about this. But this is something where I think the American people have got to say to the elites who run this country, no, you can't do this anymore. This hasn't worked for 4 decades. It's not going to work going forward. We've seen what the Chinese have been doing in the last couple months. This must not stand.
What would you say to big pharma to entice them to change, as you're suggesting?
Well, I don't know if there's anything that Gordon Chang can say to entice them. But if I were president of the United States, I would issue that executive order. And I would say to Big Pharma, if you don't like this executive order, I'm going to use the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 because I'm going to declare China to be an enemy because they declared us to be an enemy. I'm going to use my powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. I'm going to make life really miserable for you. But of course, I'm not president of the United States.
I've also noticed something that was also in your Twitter feed in terms of, sort of offering advice to policymakers. And this one hits home because I'm Canadian, as you know, that the Canadian Prime Minister recently, was describing Taiwan as being part of a greater China, which of course, Taiwan wouldn't be very thrilled with at all. And you have some, strong thoughts on it. I thought you'd give you an opportunity to offer your opinion.
Matter of fact, just before starting this conversation with you, I was about to send out another tweet on Canada. Um, Canada's Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, is acting in ways which, to me, are incomprehensible for a Western leader. Um, I guess he's just trying to curry favor with Beijing, but nonetheless, this hasn't worked for Canada. They still have the two Michaels who have been detained now for what about more than a year.
Yeah.
So Canada is sort of acting like a Chinese colony, sort of like the 34th province of China, or part of Greater China or something. He doesn't seem to be acting like a Western leader. And this has consequences because we share a pretty long border with the Canadians. And that border has always been undefended, or at least since the War of 1812. So for us, this is a matter of importance that we've got another leftist, another sort of like neo-communist running Canada. Um, I'm sure Justin Trudeau would say that he's not, but when you look at his actions, you have to say that they are very consistent with what Beijing wants, and they're not consistent at all with what many people in Canada want. And more pertinent for this discussion, they're not consistent with what the United States wants. So, you know, we don't need China on our border.
What would your advice be to the Canadian leadership?
It's good I'm not president of the United States, Jan.
Gordon, when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned that it's we're actually in a bit of a dangerous time right now for the world, I guess. Tell me what you're thinking.
Yeah, there's so many things that China is doing to try to achieve its very dangerous ambitions. But the one thing that has not really gotten the attention of the global community is the sharp increase in tempo of the People's Liberation Army in the waters and airspace around Taiwan and the southern islands of Japan. Also, China right now is challenging Indonesia around the Natuna Islands. So that's a South China Sea issue. Beijing is acting in ways which are extremely provocative and belligerent at a time when the political system in China might be under stress. Certainly looks that way. So we can't rule too much out right now, and we got to make sure that we can deter China from engaging in military misadventure.
So, do you think that China is taking advantage of this, in, obviously incredible self-focus of nations trying to deal with CCP virus?
Uh, I would think that that is a logical conclusion. You know, there can be a lot of reasons for the Chinese military for this increasingly belligerent action. But I think one of them is that they can see, for instance, that countries are distracted. All these countries are now flat on their backs. And China always tries to take advantage of opportunities. This certainly is an opportunity for Beijing. And that's why we've got to be especially concerned about the Chinese military and indeed the Chinese civilian leaders right now, because they look like they're on an exceedingly belligerent path.
Let's talk to the broader issue here. I mean, Gordon, you are the author of The Coming Collapse of China. You predicted it a little early. You got some flack for that. A number of people around me anyway have been saying, this is a moment where, and of course we're not talking about China, we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, actually, the collapse of that system, of this, whole structure that we've been discussing during this interview. What is your take, given what you're seeing? This is coming in the midst of this trade war, which of course is a much bigger thing than trade war. How are things shaping up based on your analysis of these structural issues that China faces? and the Communist Party faces?
Yeah, I think the party is actually in a very fragile condition right now. Now, I'm probably the last person to talk about this because, as you pointed out, I wrote a book in 2001. That book predicted the failure of the Communist Party within a decade. So I'm way out of time right now. But putting that aside for the moment, because this isn't about me, um, you can see that there are real problems here. So, for instance, the Chinese people are red hot angry, white hot angry, actually, about the way the party has handled the coronavirus. And we saw this on February 7th with the death of one of the Wuhan 8, one of the doctors who were whistleblowers. And that death, following it immediately, you saw across Chinese social media platforms not only anger, but you saw people demanding fundamental political change, wanting freedom of speech. And you heard the song "Do You Hear the People Sing," which is that politically impactful anthem from Les Miserables. It's the same song that people in Hong Kong have been singing as a protest of China's rule over Hong Kong. So you see people are angry. Now, it's entirely, Chinese people have gotten angry before, and there really have been no consequences to it. This time, though, there's a couple things that are different. One of them is that Beijing does not have the support of a number of countries around the world, including the US. But more important than that, you have a Chinese economy which, because of the epidemic, um, was in January and February was in deep contraction. Um, Even before the epidemic, it could have been slightly in contraction, maybe growing 1 or 2%, who knows? But clearly in the January February period, it was deep in contraction. And even in March, where there was a little bit of uptick in activity because of Xi Jinping's push to get people back to work, it was still in the red. And the problem for the Communist Party right now is that you got a lot of angry people. You've got a party which isn't going to get support from Brussels or Washington. And you've got an economy which is in very desperate straits. And so I think that essentially this is a time where Xi Jinping is vulnerable, and the whole political system itself is vulnerable. You know, people in China are talking about Chernobyl, which is the nuclear disaster in the Ukraine, 1986, 5 years before the failure of the Soviet Communist Party. I think that you see all the elements in place for the failure of the party, whether it occurs now or 5 years from now or whatever. I do think that it will happen. As I said, I've been wrong about this, about timing, but I do think though that the elements are there, and it's just a question of chance as to how they play out.
Well, I mean, to be fair to you, Gordon, I think what you outlined in the book, I think a lot of what you outlined in the book has proven to be, very, very much correct. I think perhaps you didn't predict the level of the funding from the West that China would receive in order to help for the Communist Party to sustain itself. Again, this is just my take. I want to be fair to you here.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't foresee a lot of stuff. I didn't foresee multinationals not enforcing their World Trade Organization rights. The most important thing I didn't foresee was the 2008 downturn, which, for various reasons, strengthened the hold of the party over China. Um, but as I said, this is not going to be a question of whether how wrong I was before. This is just a question for people themselves to see about what's occurring in China right now, and the way Xi Jinping is acting, which I think betrays a sense of weakness. The amount of elite criticism right now in Beijing has not been seen for quite a long time. And I think is a real indication that Xi Jinping has just made too many mistakes. Now, I recognize that having made a lot of mistakes could actually strengthen him because it makes the party so weak that people rally behind Xi Jinping because they're worried about the failure of the system. But he's made so many mistakes in 2019 and this year that I think that it really leaves the party vulnerable to a systemic failure.
The thing that's very obvious to ask here is if the thing you were wrong about was the 2008 downturn, here we have a similar situation. We have a downturn in the West. We have a mega trillion bailout, which again is in some ways analogous. And so is what you just described, is that enough to prevent another strengthening of the Communist Party, or is the situation just fundamentally different?
I think that I can see your point. I think it's an excellent point. I do see though it's a little bit different, and that is this time, unlike 2008, it's going to take a long period for China's principal export markets to recover, the United States and Europe. And that means China's not going to have anyone pulling it out of the hole this time. Also, in 2008, China had a lot of capacity to stimulate. Now they don't have that because of debt and a lot of other things. I mean, they built just too many high-speed rail lines to nowhere. Their real estate market is just completely overbuilt. These are things which weren't true, or at least weren't true to the same extent in 2008. So right now, they just don't have the firepower. The U.S., by the way, has the firepower. We had, a $2 trillion stimulus bill, which is we're going to follow it with another, big plan. We have the capacity to do that for various reasons. China doesn't. And just look at the trajectory of the renminbi. That's weakness, which we can see. And I think that China doesn't have a means of protecting its currency for that much longer, which means I think that you could see things start to slip.
So, we can see in plain sight some of the Chinese Communist Party play right now. This push to, basically kind of take control of the global system, or at least, insinuate that it's the new leader globally. What are the other elements of the CCP play here to try to achieve this dominance, out of seeming potential catastrophe?
Yeah, what they're doing is they are, as you talked about before, building those links. Trying to say, well, they're the savior of Italy, they're the savior of the Netherlands, they're the savior of the Czech Republic. Problem is that when you sell defective masks, when you sell diagnostic kits that are 80% inaccurate, you have a little bit of problem there with the image. And I think that the one thing that China has now, which is going to be difficult for them, is they've really irritated the senior leadership of the United States, in addition, of course, to the American people. And so the conversation in this country right now is very different than it was in 2008. And without the support of the U.S., Xi Jinping's going to have a very difficult period. Got to remember, Jan, that he has deinstitutionalized the Communist Party. You don't have these rules on succession, you don't have term limits, all the types of things that would help a leader who is in trouble, because they sort of minimize the adverse consequences of
Mm.
making mistakes. Those rules don't exist anymore because when you've got full power, absolute power, you got absolute responsibility. Xi Jinping doesn't have that many people to blame. So you put those two trends together, and I think that it means a fragility of the system. So yeah, despite China has a lot of cards to play, but it has a lot of weaknesses, and we've got to understand those weaknesses because they limit the ability of Xi Jinping to accomplish objectives.
Gordon, communist systems, wherever they exist, we know they always need to have an enemy, a clear enemy. Is the US now that target going forward?
Oh, absolutely. And just to go back to this Pearl Harbor issue. May last year they declared people's war. I don't know how you get closer to the word enemy than that. So Beijing has decided that it's going to go after the U.S. Xi Jinping obviously believes he can push us aside. So he's going to see how strong America really is. And we're just going to have to defend ourselves. And defending ourselves, I believe, means that we will come to a realization that we're not there yet, Jan, but I think we will come to a realization that there can be no peaceful coexistence on a long-term basis with China. Either it's the People's Republic of China or it's the United States of America, not both.
of course, America, again, we talked about this model of wanting to help other countries rather than make them dependent. I think this is kind of the American ethos, at least to me. So I think a lot of American leaders, and certainly myself, could imagine a flourishing China, but obviously without the current leadership as it exists. Um, is should America or other Western nations be doing something to help strengthen, the Chinese people, the China without the Communist Party?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that will just drive Xi Jinping and his fellow despots up the wall is if we start talking in earnest to the Chinese people. That is the one thing that they cannot abide. We need to stop these conversations that we have, these buddy-buddy conversations with Xi, and start saying to him in public, you're going to be gone. We believe that it's in the national interest of the United States to seek the end of Communist Party rule to China. And we're going to do just about everything we possibly can. In other words, we need to say to Xi Jinping what we said to a succession of Soviet leaders. It took a Ronald Reagan to sort of crystallize that after a number of US presidents took a much softer line. But we have, someone called Donald John Trump who has given the Chinese a little bit of a difficult time, even though he sometimes uses overly generous language when he addresses Xi Jinping. I believe that there's a leader in the White House who is unpredictable enough. And even, you look at the Democratic Party, the establishment wing of the Democratic Party, Chuck Schumer, minority leader in the Senate, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker in the House, they have posture on China was actually tougher than Trump's. So there's just no really good solution, I think, for the Chinese right now. Whoever wins in November is going to give them a hard time, and that's a good thing.
Well, what would some sort of, peaceful change, like a best case scenario, look like? I mean, I think you must have imagined what this might look like.
Yeah, it looks like Xi Jinping waking up one morning and said, "Oh my God, for decades I've been wrong, and I'm going to hold national elections tomorrow."
Not likely. if
No, if you look at political change in China, it's had two revolutions: the 1911 revolution and the one that was succeeded in 1949. Both of those involved great loss of life. And unfortunately, the Communist Party has made sure that in China, you don't have those elements that could lead a peaceful change. So we've got to be very concerned about how political change in China works out. Um, but, we can always hope for the best. Long term, Jan, I think the Chinese people get it right. They want the same things we want, and they're perfectly capable of getting there. So we shouldn't underestimate them. But nonetheless, they've got a malign political system that is going to do its best. As you said, their number one goal is to stay in power, Communist Party. So they're going to make this as bloody and as atrocious and as tragic as possible.
Gordon, just before we finish up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the naming of the virus. There's been a lot of discussion about this, both in the administration, on social media. We have Wuhan virus, Chinese virus. We have the Epoch Times version, CCP virus. I'm sure you understand why. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm Chinese American, and you've heard a lot of people say that the geographical designation, Wuhan virus, Chinese virus, is racist. Well, it's not racist because you have to look at it in the context in which the president, the vice president, and the secretary of state has used those terms. This is after China, for basically the beginning of February, has engaged in this campaign to tar the United States on all things epidemic. And also that March 12th tweet that we talked about earlier, saying the virus started in the US. Well, President Trump was making the point in a graphic way that this virus did not start in America. This virus started in China, and we're just not going to put up with this. So I'm very happy to have heard him say those things because he was defending my country. And we Americans have to understand that we have a common enemy. That common enemy means us harm. That common enemy has been attacking us for a very long time, but has stepped up the pace and tempo in recent months. And whether people like President Trump or not, whether they're going to vote for him in November, whether or not, I don't care. We've only got one president, and we need someone to defend us between now and January of next year.
Gordon Chang, such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Jan. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.